All right, diving in today. And we're tackling a concept, pretty big one, that has really shaped how the West has seen the East.
Yeah.
Historically speaking, I'm talking about Orientalism.
Yeah, Orientalism.
It's a powerful idea. Really came to the forefront, I guess you could say, thanks to Edward Said. His book, Orientalism, a classic. It gives us this framework, this way to understand how the West has, well, perceived, and often I think misperceived, the East.
Right, exactly, misperceived, yeah.
And it gets into this whole relationship between these two huge parts of the world.
It's huge.
So for this deep dive, we're going to be specifically looking at the work of Dr. Jasvant Rathod. He offers some really valuable insights into, well, Said's main arguments, I think.
Yeah, definitely, he does.
So our goal today for you listening is to give you a solid understanding of Orientalism.
Yeah.
What it is, the main ideas, and why it still matters so much, even today.
Why it's relevant.
In cultural studies, all of that. So let's get into it. Said's central argument, and Dr. Rathod really helps to kind of unpack this for us,
Yeah.
is that this division that we often make between East and West,
Right.
or the Orient and the Occident, it's not like a natural thing.
Right.
You know what I mean? It's not like this pre-existing fact. He's saying it's artificial.
It's a construct.
It's a construct, like something that Europeans created and sort of solidified over time.
And they kind of drew that line.
They drew that line, and it boils down to this idea of them and us.
Exactly. Them versus us.
So what's fascinating, and I think Dr. Rathod really brings this out, is that Said is saying it wasn't just, they just looked at the East and said, oh, they're different. They actively developed Orientalism as a field of study.
Yeah.
Like an academic thing.
Yeah, well, discipline.
But, and here's the big but, Said argues that this study, this whole field, wasn't objective. It was used to define people in the Orient, not just as different or even exotic, but as less developed.
Wait, inherently inferior.
Yeah, inherently inferior.
Yeah.
So it wasn't just about looking and observing, it was about establishing this hierarchy.
Power dynamic, yeah.
And this is where it gets even more interesting, I think.
Okay, yeah.
Dr. Rathod emphasizes how this whole idea of the Oriental acted like a mirror for the West.
That's interesting.
Right. Because by saying, okay, people in the East are, let's say, lazy, irrational, uncivilized.
Right, those classic stereotypes.
Yeah, Europeans could then define themselves as the opposite. They were the active ones, the rational ones, the civilized ones.
So you're defining yourself in opposition to this other.
Exactly, exactly. So you can see how this kind of self-definition, it had a purpose.
It wasn't just an abstract idea.
No, it wasn't abstract at all. It shaped how they understood the world and how they acted in the world.
It had real-world consequences.
Absolutely. And one of the most damaging things about this, and both Said and Dr. Rathod talk about this, is the generalizations.
Yeah, taking this idea and applying it to everyone.
Right. It's not just saying, oh, this one person is this way. It's like entire populations, everyone gets branded with these characteristics.
And you see this reflected in, reports from scholars.
Literature.
All forms of media, yeah.
And it continues. The examples that Dr. Rathod gives are, well, I mean, you see them all the time.
Oh, absolutely.
The stereotypes of Arabs as uncivilized. Or like the immediate association of Islam with terrorism.
Right, like all Muslims are terrorists, which of course.
Which is obviously ridiculous.
But these aren't random ideas. They're rooted in this history of generalization and stereotyping.
And this wasn't just like theoretical. This had real-world consequences.
Bro, yeah, huge consequences.
Dr. Rath is really clear about that. This concept of Orientalism became a justification for European colonization.
Like, it gave them a reason to do what they did.
Right. If you really believe that you're dealing with a population that's uncivilized and incapable of governing themselves,
then it becomes, like, your duty to step in.
Right. Colonizing them, taking control, it's framed as a good thing, like you're helping them.
The white man's burden, right.
Yeah, exactly. And the text actually uses that phrase, to civilize the uncivilized.
Wow.
And this brings up a really important point, which is agency. Who has the power to act? Who's making the decisions? Said argues that this whole process involved actively orientalizing the Orient. It's not passive. Europeans took their preconceived notions, their ideas about what the East was like, and they projected them onto the people who actually lived there.
So they were shaping the image of the East.
Exactly. It's like, imagine these Orientalists, these scholars, they go to the East, they observe things, but maybe they're taking those observations out of context.
Right, not seeing the full picture.
And then they use those isolated observations to make generalizations about entire cultures. Like, it's like taking one tiny brushstroke and then saying you understand the whole painting.
And Dr. Rathod gives a really, really interesting example of this Western-centric view.
Okay, what is it?
Renaming Islam Mohammedism.
Mohammedism.
Yeah. It's like they were trying to make it fit into this Western Christian analogy, like Christianity has Christ, so Islam must have Muhammad.
Oh, I see. Like they're imposing their own framework.
And what's striking is that there was no input from Muslims themselves. Like, nobody asked them what they called their religion. It's just this complete disregard for their own perspective.
That's so interesting. And, what's fascinating, too, is how this perspective evolved.
Okay, how so?
The text points out that later on there was a shift. The Orient became romanticized. Like, in European literature, it starts to be portrayed as this pure, peaceful place.
Like a paradise lost, kind of.
Yeah, kind of. But even in this, quote-unquote, positive view, Said argues, it's still about control.
How so?
Because it still positions the Orientals as naive.
Ah, I see.
Like, they need European guidance. They can't handle things on their own.
It's still defining them in relation to the West. Right. Not letting them stand on their own.
Exactly. So even when it seems positive, it's still about maintaining that sense of Western superiority.
And the justifications just kept coming, didn't they?
Oh, yeah. I mean, the text even mentions how Darwin's theories about evolution and natural selection were used to argue for European superiority.
Like they're biologically superior.
Yeah. And they also push this idea that Europeans discovered the Orient.
Like it didn't exist until they found it.
Right. And of course, this all reinforces their supposed right to rule.
It's all connected.
To really understand how this all worked, it's helpful to look at some specific people. The text highlights Sylvester de Sacy, and actually, Said gives him some credit.
Oh, okay. How so?
For his organizational contributions to the field of Orientalism. And he points out that de Sacy seemed to have less prejudice than some of the others.
So a bit of a more nuanced figure, maybe.
Yeah, it seems that way. But then you have someone like Ernest Renan. He built on de Sacy's work, but he was much more biased, I think.
In what way?
Well, he really connected Orientalism to philology.
Philology.
Study of language in its historical and cultural context. He thought it was the key to understanding the Orient.
So different approaches, but within this same overall framework.
And then in the 20th century, things shift again.
Okay, what happened?
The text talks about how these new Orientalists, they started to become more involved in the daily lives of the people they were studying.
Oh, interesting. So not just observing from a distance.
No, more hands-on.
Yeah.
But, and this is important, it wasn't necessarily out of genuine respect or appreciation.
What was it then?
The text says it pretty bluntly. To know more about the Orients in order to rule them properly.
Control again.
Control. Yeah. It's about more effective control. And Lawrence of Arabia is a perfect example of this.
Yeah, that makes sense. He was deeply involved in Arab affairs.
But what's also interesting is how the attitudes towards different parts of the Orient varied.
Okay, like where?
The text points out that while there was a move toward a more, liberal stance on a lot of subjects, Islamic Orientalism did not enjoy this status.
Interesting. So they were still targeting Islam.
Yeah. There were all these attempts to portray Islam as, like, weak and derivative. And the text mentions Gibb as a prominent figure in Islamic Orientalism. It shows how even within this field, there were certain areas that were subject to, more bias than others.
So even within Orientalism, there were hierarchies.
Absolutely. And then the center of gravity shifted geographically. After World War I, the U.S. started to take on a much bigger role.
Yeah.
And the focus of Orientalism became more and more tied to social science and to informing government policy.
Oh, wow. So it's not just academics anymore.
No, it's directly influencing how the U.S. interacts with the East. And even though European colonies, officially ended after World War II, the prejudice didn't just disappear.
Like the ideas persisted.
Oh, yeah. I mean, look at some of the examples in the text. Arabs are still often portrayed as cruel and violent. The Japanese, they're reduced to, like, karate experts. Muslims are constantly linked to terrorism. It's all still there.
It's like those old stereotypes, just updated for a new era.
And this is where Said's Orientalism, his book, becomes so important.
Because he's challenging all of this.
Exactly. The text emphasizes how it was a revolutionary work. Translated into tons of languages, sparked all this debate, especially with Bernard Lewis, another scholar.
Yeah, I've heard of him.
Even critics, like George P. Landau, they acknowledged it was a major work, even if they didn't agree with everything Said. And Paul Deman, another important figure in literary criticism, he was very supportive of Said's work.
It really shook things up in terms of how people thought about the East. But it's also important to remember, and the text makes this clear, that Said wasn't the first person to talk about this.
Right? He's building on other people's work.
Yeah, people like Abdelrahman al-Jabarti. He's an interesting figure. B.G. Kiernan, Bernard S. Cohn, Anwar Abdelmalek. They all explored these same dynamics, between Western power and knowledge of the Orient.
It wasn't just said out of nowhere.
Right. And as Khalal Assad, he's an anthropologist, as you argued, Orientalism isn't just a list of prejudices. It's an analysis of this whole system, the Orientalist discourse, as he calls it, this way of thinking and writing about the East that keeps reinforcing itself.
The whole structure, a way of seeing the world.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that Said didn't really focus on visual art in his analysis.
That's true.
Although the text does mention how Lyndon Auckland and others have kind of applied his ideas to painting.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah. But to really understand Said's argument, you have to understand some of his key concepts, like latent Orientalism and manifest Orientalism.
Okay, yeah. What are those?
So latent Orientalism, those are the unconscious, deep-seated beliefs about the Orient.
Yeah.
Like this idea that it's inherently different and backward and sensual and passive.
Like the stereotypes that just kind of lurk in the back of your mind?
Yeah, exactly. And then manifest Orientalism is how those beliefs are expressed.
Okay, how they show up in the real world.
Right. It could be written, works, political decisions, even just, actions that you see in everyday life.
So latent is the potential and manifest is the actualization.
Exactly. And running through all of this, as the text makes clear, is the idea of knowledge as power.
Oh, yeah. That's huge.
Right. It's saying that the West's study of the Orient, it wasn't just about gaining knowledge.
It was about control.
It led to a sense of ownership, of control. The West became the active subject, the one who's looking and studying. And the Orient, it became the passive object, the thing being studied.
And that's how the Orient as a concept was constructed?
Exactly. It's like Said is saying Orientalist scholars, they created this idea of the Orient as this single thing.
This homogeneous entity.
Yeah, encompassing all these incredibly diverse cultures.
Oversimplifying it.
Completely.
Yeah.
They created this stereotype of the Oriental as biologically inferior, culturally backward, and this allowed them to treat this vast, incredibly complex region as one thing, something they could know and ultimately control.
And this isn't just ancient history.
Oh no, this is still happening today.
I mean, look at how Arab cultures are often depicted in the West. As irrational, menacing, untrustworthy.
The text argues that this is just an evolved form of Orientalist thinking.
Same old ideas, new packaging.
And it's still influencing ideologies and policies.
Affecting how people see the world, how decisions are made.
And there's this powerful quote from Said where he talks about writing about the Arab world with the authority of a nation.
Wow.
It shows how deeply ingrained these ideas are. They become part of how we understand the world, almost like objective truth.
Yeah, like it's just a fact.
So what did Said want to do about all this?
Yeah, what was his solution?
The text talks about questioning assumptions, rejecting generalizations, and moving towards narrative over vision.
What does that mean, narrative over vision?
I think it means instead of trying to grasp the East in this grand, sweeping, visual way.
Like trying to see the whole thing at once.
Yeah. We need to focus on individual stories, on specific histories. We need to listen to the people of the East, let them tell their own stories in their own words.
To give them agency.
Exactly. And ultimately, it's about rejecting this whole artificial divide.
Between East and West.
Said was arguing against these essentialist boundaries. He was saying the Orient, just like the Occident, isn't some static fact.
It's fluid, it's
shaped by history, by power dynamics.
Like who's telling the story?
And it's so important to recognize that this whole discourse about the Orient, it was only possible because of this imbalance of power. The West had the power, and they used that power to define the East. And as Said argues, Orientalism isn't just some fantasy, some made-up idea.
It has real consequence.
It's a system of knowledge that has shaped how the West sees and interacts with the East, and it continues to do so. So to kind of summarize this deep dive into Orientalism, what we've seen is that Edward Said, and Dr. Rathod really helps us to understand this, he challenged this whole idea of a fixed East-West divide.
This line in the sand.
He said it's artificial. It was created during the period of European colonialism. And the Orient, this idea of the Orient, was defined and often stereotyped in a way that served the West.
Serve their interests?
It helped them to define themselves and to justify their dominance over the East. And this wasn't just harmless academic study. It had real consequences. It shaped perceptions, policies, and those things continue to affect the world today.
And it raises a question for all of us, listening. How much are we still influenced by these historical patterns of thought?
That's a good question.
When we think about different cultures, different regions of the world, are we, maybe without even realizing it, using some of these same frameworks, these same lenses?
Are we still seeing the world through an Orientalist lens? That's the big question, isn't it? And if this idea of the Orient, if it was really constructed by the West, how do we move beyond that? How do we foster genuine understanding between cultures?
Yeah, how do we undo that damage?
And what role does authentic self-representation play in that? Like letting people speak for themselves, tell their own stories. It's something to think about.
Absolutely. And if you're interested in learning more, I highly recommend checking out Edward Said's Orientalism.
Yeah, it's a really important book.
There's so much to unpack there, so much to think about. It's definitely worth the read.
All right. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
Yeah, thanks for listening. All right, so you're here on the deep dive, and you know how this works by now.
That's right.
We're diving into some seriously big ideas, stuff that could take you, weeks or even months to really get your head around if you were going at it alone.
Yeah.
But we're all about shortcuts here, right? We're going to try to unpack a book that is just so foundational for how we understand the relationship between the West and the East.
I think that's right.
And I think I'm not exaggerating when I say that
Nope.
Edward Said's Orientalism is, I mean, it's one of those books that everyone cites. And it's a big one. So
Yeah, it's a big one.
I think what we want to do today is really give you the express route to what are the central arguments of this book.
Okay.
And why should you care? Why does it still matter today?
Yeah.
And really, I think our mission here is to understand how the West has historically constructed this thing we call the Orient. And we're doing this based on, really serious scholarship, right?
Yeah.
We're not just, spouting off opinions or, whatever's floating around out there on the internet.
Yeah, I think a good way to think about it, too, is that Orientalism as a topic, it isn't some kind of abstract academic exercise.
Right.
This is something that really gets at the core of how we even categorize and understand different parts of the world.
Yeah.
And I think that it's really interesting because it's a book that challenges us to look critically at the things that we think we know.
Okay, so let's just jump right into it.
Let's do it.
Says right off the bat that Orientalism isn't just a collection of, sort of individual ideas about the East. He calls it a discourse.
Okay.
What does he mean by that?
So I think for Said, when he says discourse, what he's really getting at is that this is a sort of powerful lens that the West used.
Okay.
Not only to see the East, but to create a certain image of it.
Right.
Which then sort of justified a lot of the actions that took place as a result of that. And this wasn't just, innocent observation.
Yeah.
He really makes the argument that this kind of structured system of knowledge and ideas and practices was really deeply interwoven with the West's own economic and social and political power.
Right.
So the West was in a position to be able to study the East.
Yeah.
Often without a lot of pushback, from the people who actually lived in those places.
Right.
And ultimately to rule them.
Yeah. So in order to understand how these ideas got so, I guess, widespread and accepted, Said draws on the work of this thinker, Antonio Gramsci.
Okay.
And his idea of hegemony. And this might sound a little bit theoretical, but it's actually, I think, a really powerful idea.
Absolutely.
To help explain why these views became, almost like common sense, or just like the water we swim in, so to speak.
Yeah, yeah. So, I mean, if we want to connect this to the bigger picture, right?
Yeah.
Gramsci.
Yeah.
I think what he helps us see is that power isn't just about force, right? Like armies and things like that.
Yeah.
But also he talks about civil society. So things like culture and media and education.
Right.
Where influence operates through a kind of consent.
Right.
So, you consent to certain ideas.
Yeah.
You're taught certain ideas that become so dominant that they just sort of feel like common sense. This is what Gramsci means by hegemony.
Right.
And I think Said's argument is that, this notion of European superiority,
Yeah.
right, which is built in contrast to this idea of the Orient, that this became, a kind of hegemonic idea
Yeah.
that then shapes how the West sees itself
Right.
and how it sees the East.
So it wasn't just about like understanding some place far off. It was also really fundamental to defining who we are as us here in the West.
Yeah, and often by saying that we're better than them.
Yeah, that's a pretty striking claim.
Yeah, it is. And I think Seed is really, he stresses this point that this idea of Europe as sort of a unified and superior entity.
Right.
This was something that was actively constructed in opposition to non-European peoples and cultures.
Right.
Right. So the Orient becomes this kind of essential other, a kind of mirror reflecting back what Europe supposedly is and isn't.
Right.
So it's about forging an us
Yeah.
by defining a them.
Right. And all of this is happening during a very specific period in history when Europe really rises to, global power.
Yeah, that's a really crucial point.
Yeah.
I mean, Tennessee, he emphasizes the period from the late Renaissance onward. As he calls it a time of extraordinary European ascendancy.
Yeah.
Right. And so this meant that Westerners had the power to travel, to study, to write about the Orient, often without a lot of resistance for the people who lived there. So there was this real imbalance of power that was really crucial in shaping the kind of knowledge that was produced about this region of the world.
So we see with this Western dominance, this very specific picture of the Orient starts to emerge. And it sounds like what you're saying is that it's not necessarily based on what was actually happening in those places,
Right.
but more on what the West needed or wanted to see.
Yeah, I think that's a great way of putting it.
Okay.
I mean, Said's point is that under this kind of Western hegemony, this very particular Orient emerges.
Right.
Right. It's not like this was some pre-existing unified thing just waiting to be discovered.
Yeah.
Right. It was constructed for all sorts of different Western purposes. Academic study, for example. We see these elaborate museum displays that are popping up.
Right.
It's being used to justify colonial rule.
Yeah.
And it's even providing kind of theoretical examples for, Western theories in fields like anthropology or biology.
Right.
So all of these sort of, supposed truths about the Orient said are heavily influenced by Western desires, repressions, investments, projections, and not just, kind of objective observation.
Now, Said had to deal with just this, huge amount of material
Oh, yeah.
on the Orient. And he talks about this need to balance a kind of general understanding of Orientalism with looking at specific writers and texts. Why was that important to his approach?
So this raises a really interesting methodological point, I think.
Okay.
He recognized that there's this risk of making these sweeping generalizations about Orientalism as a whole.
Right.
But there's also the danger of getting too bogged down in the kind of individual details.
Yeah.
And then missing the bigger picture.
Right.
So his aim was to kind of analyze both the overarching system of ideas, like, European superiority or the justification of imperialism,
Right.
but also the specific ways in which individual authors engaged with the Orient in their own work.
Okay.
So it's about striking this balance between seeing these common patterns
Yeah.
while also acknowledging, the individual nuances.
Yeah, and he really pushes back against this idea of pure knowledge,
Mm-hmm.
this sort of apolitical view of knowledge, particularly, I think, in the academic world.
Yeah.
He says, scholars are never really truly detached observers.
Yeah, and I think this is really fascinating because what he's insisting on here is that knowledge, and particularly in the humanities, is never truly neutral.
Okay.
He believed that scholars are always shaped by their social context,
Yeah.
by their beliefs and their position within society. And, in the context of imperial powers like 19th century Britain, even seemingly objective intellectual work about the colonies was inevitably influenced by the fact that, these were British colonies. The political realities on the ground really shaped the intellectual landscape back home.
Right. So for him, this link between knowledge and power is just fundamental.
Absolutely.
And that kind of leads us to, this argument that Orientalism is so deeply connected to imperialism itself.
Yeah. I think for Set, these two things are just intrinsically linked. He sees Orientalism as being, fundamentally connected to imperialism.
Right.
The political, the military control that was exerted by the West over the East.
Right.
But, and I think this is a really important distinction, he doesn't see culture as just passively reflecting political power.
Okay.
He actually argues that culture actively creates interest in the Orient.
Mm-hmm.
It provides the intellectual and the imaginative kind of justifications that then support imperial ventures.
Right.
It's not just a reflection of what's happening. It's actually helping to make it happen or to justify it.
Right, so he even defines Orientalism in this very specific way,
Yeah.
as this distribution of geopolitical awareness.
Okay.
What does that look like in practice?
So think about it as the way in which the West took its understanding of the world,
Okay.
right? This dominant Occident and a subordinate Orient.
Mm-hmm.
And they distributed this understanding across all sorts of different kinds of texts,
Okay.
from, scholarly books to novels to travel writings.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's not just that they're describing a geographical division.
Mm-hmm.
They're actually creating and maintaining
Right.
a set of Western interests in the Orient
Mm-hmm.
that are driven by this desire to understand, to control, and even to incorporate this different world into their own.
It sounds like Saad is also suggesting that even when Western authors thought they were just, sort of exploring the individual genius of, let's say, Eastern writers or thinkers,
Yeah.
they were often overlooking the larger political and ideological forces that were really shaping their own perspective.
Yeah, I mean, that's a key point, right? That while Sud acknowledges things like literary tradition,
Right.
the ways in which texts influence other texts,
Mm-hmm.
he points out that there's this real reluctance to acknowledge the impact of political and institutional and ideological constraints on individual authors.
Right.
There's this kind of romantic notion of the lone creative genius.
Uh-huh.
But what Said's saying is that, even creative work is shaped by these broader power structures.
Yeah, and he gives this really powerful example, I think, of philosophers like Locke,
Right.
and showing these direct connections between their philosophical ideas
Mm-hmm.
and the justification of things like slavery and colonialism.
Absolutely.
So, he's really trying to highlight these explicit connections
Yeah.
in some of the most influential thinkers in Western tradition
Mm-hmm.
to demonstrate how, philosophical doctrines could be directly used
Yeah.
to rationalize and to support these really exploitative practices.
I mean, it's really challenging, the idea
Yeah,
that philosophy exists in some kind of abstract realm
right.
that's untouched by real-world power dynamics.
Yeah, he's saying that's just not true.
It's just not true.
Right, but he's not just saying that these political influences were, bad or
Right.
limiting or something.
Yeah.
He's actually saying that they were productive
Yeah.
in shaping the field of Orientalism.
Yes, and I think this is important to understand.
Yeah.
He argues that these political influences weren't simply limiting, right?
Mm-hmm.
They actively shapes the entire field of Orientalism
Right.
in really profound ways. Imperialism wasn't just a backdrop.
Right.
It fundamentally governed what was studied, how it was studied,
Mm-hmm.
the very imagination surrounding the Orient and the institutions that were, producing knowledge about it.
Yeah.
And to ignore this connection, Said argues was really, intellectually dishonest.
So for Said, really understanding Orientalism means looking at this dynamic exchange
Mm-hmm.
between, individual authors and the overarching political concerns
Right.
of, these major empires,
Yeah.
Britain, France, the United States.
Exactly. He sees Orientalism as this kind of constant back and forth.
Yeah.
Right? And he poses some really crucial political questions about how various academic fields, from the study of languages to
Right.
poetry,
Yeah.
all contributed to this broadly imperialist worldview. Right? So he wants us to examine, he says, the alliance between cultural work, political tendencies, the state, and the specific realities of domination.
And ultimately, Said's work had just this massive impact.
Oh, yeah.
It offered this, really much needed correction
Mm-hmm.
to how the West had been approaching studying the Arab and Asian worlds.
Yeah, Orientalism, I think, delivered this really powerful critique by exposing these underlying assumptions of dominance and subjection
Right.
that were often just, baked into Western scholarship.
Mm-hmm.
So he effectively showed how the Orient was often reduced to this, simplistic, often negative stereotype,
Right, yeah.
irrational, emotional, unchanging,
Yeah,
while Western superiority was simply taken as a given.
right.
So, Sade showed us that when the West talked about the mysterious East, they weren't just describing it.
Mhm.
They were setting up this power dynamic
Yeah,
where the West was normal
right.
and the East was other, often in a way that, justified taking control.
Yeah, and he also talks about this this sort of other interesting, almost like reverse problem, this danger of romanticizing the Orient as this kind of perfect escape from Western ills.
Absolutely. I think that's a crucial secondary point.
Okay.
He warned against the tendency to see this, the passionate and mystical Orient as this kind of, simplistic fix for the problems of Western culture.
Right.
And so, this uncritical embrace of often misunderstood Eastern ideas can be just as problematic as outright negativity.
Right.
Because it still essentializes and flattens this very complex reality.
So that's a really powerful framework that Edward Said lays out.
It is.
But as with any, really influential work,
Of course.
Orientalism has faced its share of scrutiny. And one of the major points you mentioned is this critique that comes from Aijaz Ahmad.
Yeah.
And he's really focusing on the agency of the Orient itself.
That's all right.
So let's talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, this raises this really important question, I think, about perspective. And Ahmad argues that, Orientalism tends to focus too heavily on Western responsibility and that it doesn't adequately address the kind of internal dynamics and, self-inflicted problems within Oriental societies themselves.
Right.
So he's calling for a more balanced view.
Yeah.
One that considers both the impact of Western influence, but also the agency and the complexities of the societies that are being studied.
Right. And another point of critique concerns, Said's primary focus on Britain, France, and the United States. And, he does acknowledge this limitation.
He does.
But what are the implications of this kind of narrower focus?
So, while Said's focus on the dominant colonial powers makes a certain logical sense, it does mean that he largely overlooks the scholarship and the perspectives of other European nations who had, long and intricate relationships with the Orient. And so, this exclusion potentially misses, nuances and different approaches to understanding the East.
And you specifically mentioned the neglect of German scholarship.
Yeah.
Why is that a significant omission?
So this is interesting because German scholarship had a huge influence on intellectual traditions across Europe and in the U.S. And by not engaging with it, Said kind of misses this key part of this broader European understanding of the Orient. Furthermore, the historical context of the German Reich's direct involvement against the Ottoman Empire.
Right.
It was a continuation of centuries of conflict between Europe and the Islamic world.
Right.
Significantly shaped European perceptions of the Orient in the 18th and 19th centuries.
Right.
A context that Said largely overlooks.
And the example of the Balkans, I think, really highlights this.
Yes.
This complexity within Europe's relationship with the Orient.
Yeah, absolutely.
European approaches to Balkan independence. And even occasional support for the Ottomans against other European powers really demonstrates that the Orient, in the form of the Ottoman Empire, remained this significant and complex factor in European political calculations. It wasn't this simple case of a unified Europe viewing a completely alien other.
Exactly.
It's almost like this idea of the Orient became a kind of character in the Western imagination.
Yeah, and I think critics have pointed out that, Said's focus can sometimes overlook the internal othering and construction of difference within Europe itself. Right. So the example of this mythical Slavic province of Ruritania illustrates this idea of this more nuanced kind of spectrum of how otherness gets constructed. And, even Said himself notes different levels of Western knowledge about the Near and Far East, which again suggests that the picture is a lot more complex than this simple, Occident-Orient kind of divide.
And, kind of shifting gears a bit.
Okay.
You brought up this alternative perspective on, European exploration and trade with India and the Far East. And, it wasn't solely driven by this kind of hostility toward Islam, was it?
No, I mean, while religious and cultural differences certainly played a role, a really significant driving force, I think, behind European exploration and the establishment of these kind of direct trade routes was probably, mercantile concerns. This desire to reduce costs. And to increase profits
Right.
by cutting out Arab middlemen. So the Arab reaction to, Portuguese entry into the Indian Ocean, for example, was primarily about being excluded from this lucrative trade with India, which suggests that, economic motivations were a key factor
Right.
in shaping Western engagement with the East,
Right.
potentially leading to different forms of scholarship and understanding.
So a variety of motivations, not just this kind of monolithic hostility,
Right.
likely fueled, Western interest in and study of the Orient,
Yeah,
leading to a more complex picture of the Occident itself.
precisely. And I think, these critiques don't necessarily dismantle Seed's central argument,
Right.
about the kind of institutionalized power dynamics
Right.
inherent in Western European Orientalism.
Mm-hmm.
However, I think they do highlight the need for a more nuanced and multifaceted kind of analysis
Right.
that considers the agency of the East,
Mm-hmm.
the complexities within Europe,
Right.
and the diverse motivations behind Western engagement with the Orient.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a refinement, not necessarily an invalidation
Yeah.
of this, very important critique.
Okay, so to kind of recap what we've done here today,
Okay.
we've taken this deep dive into Seed's Orientalism. And we've looked at his argument that the West essentially constructed this idea of the Orient
Right.
as a way to define itself and to maintain power.
We explored his concepts of discourse and hegemony
Yeah,
and how knowledge and imperialism were really intertwined.
absolutely.
And we also examined some of the key criticisms that push for this, more nuanced view, acknowledging the agency of the East and the complexities within the West itself.
Yeah, I think, understanding this historical construction is absolutely crucial for critically examining contemporary perceptions
Yeah.
of different cultures and regions.
All right.
It helps us, I think, to be aware of the potential for simplistic generalizations
Right.
and to question the underlying assumptions that might still shape our understanding of the world.
Absolutely. So here's a final thought for you to consider.
Okay.
Given how this idea of the Orient was historically constructed, how might other categories of difference,
Right.
whether based on things like race, class, gender, or other cultural distinctions,
Yeah.
be similarly constructed? And what are the real-world consequences of those constructions?
When it comes to power dynamics and how we define who's in and who's out,
Right.
it's a really powerful lens, I think, for looking at the world around us.
I think so, too.
So that's it for our deep dive into Edward Said's Orientalism.
Great stuff.
We'll see you next time.
See you later.
Bye. Bye.
Take care.
Yep.
All right.
Cool.
Sounds good.
All right. See ya.
All right, bye.
Bye.
See ya.
Thanks.
Cheers.
No.
Take care.
Bye.